Hey guys, I'm Sam. I'm a staff member for the Climbing Academy in Glasgow. Today we're having an interview with Dr Ry McHenry. He's a Glasgow-based climber, and last year during the first lockdown he was remobilised back to intensive care to help people with coronavirus. As a result of him being back home during lockdown as well and doing lots and lots of training as a result, he had an incredible year for climbing as well. And we wanted to ask him about how he found last year and how his climbing year was. So yeah, hope you find it interesting, guys, and yeah, enjoy. So this is Ry. Hi Ry, how are you doing?
Hi, very good. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks for coming, man. Can you just tell me before we kind of get on with a few questions, who are you and what do you do?
So I'm a climber. I've been climbing for almost 20 years now. I've been very fortunate to travel internationally, but probably spend most of my time trying and climb up my limit in the mountains and sea cliffs around Scotland. I'm also an emergency medicine doctor in the west of Scotland. I spent the last year between working in intensive care in the first wave of the COVID pandemic and between emergency departments in the west of Scotland as well.
One of the things I really admire about Ry, when the pandemic hit, he chose to volunteer to go back into ICU, intensive care. That was right, wasn't it, Ry?
And yeah, so I suppose at that point, a lot of us were being remobilised to where the need was greatest. And one of the things for us was to make sure that we were in the place where we were required. So lots of people were pulled from other jobs to support the work that was going on in intensive care.
So, Ry, tell me about how you found 2020.
I suppose, like all of us, a pretty challenging year. You know, it started pretty innocuously at this time last year. Things were pretty good. Looking forward to a big season of climbing and also progressing with things in work. I think that really things started to change for us in intensive care maybe in mid-January, whenever there were these murmurings of a virus coming from Wuhan. And at that point, it probably took us maybe about a month to realise it was going to be a big deal for us in intensive care. But we didn't really have any idea of how much of an impact it would have on our day-to-day lives as well. Obviously, things changed pretty dramatically in the middle of March, and everyone who could was remobilised back to intensive care to support the great need that was going on there. I think what followed was probably some of the most difficult work that I've ever done, and probably some of those challenging points of my life. I think with that, a huge privilege of working in intensive care in a point where there was such a huge need, and really there was a collective effort from all of society to try and protect intensive care beds and to try to really deal with this pandemic and with this completely unprecedented situation as a community. I think one of the interesting things about 2020 for me was how that really impacted on my climbing as well, and that's something that's been a big focus for really quite a long time for me. I think that in those early days of March and April, I kind of put any plans of doing anything this year out the window and was really focusing on the work. But I suppose one of the things that the pandemic did was it gave me quite a lot of focus. So in between the really quite intense working shifts, I was able to put some of that time towards doing some really focused and dedicated training. And actually that really paid off in terms of some of the climbing I was able to do this year. And I probably ended up having maybe the best trad climbing season that I've ever had. Doing some really amazing routes with some great friends whenever we were allowed out during the summer.
That's amazing. So, for context, I lived with Ry through quite a few months of the lockdown, and in January when things started to begin, we were in Sierrana having a really amazing climbing time. We're like, oh, it's gonna be fantastic, and there was all this news coming in about things sort of trickling in, and Ry was like at the forefront of telling us about this. And we're like, yeah, sure, whatever. And then I remember sitting where Ry is right now in this kitchen whenever Boris Johnson announced the lockdown. We're like, oh, wow, it's actually real. It's actually happening. But what I really admired, there was days Ry would come in from work and he was tired and he'd put his little trad music tunes on and he grabbed that Beastmaker 2000 and that boy pulled and pulled and pulled. He got his weights out and it was amazing just seeing what happened. And I remember Ry talking about how fingerboarding, he was like, I've never felt my fingers have been so strong, and then that translated into the year that Ry had, which is incredible. So, Ry, can you tell me about some of your climbing achievements for this year?
Yeah, so I suppose that was one of the most surprising things about this year. Was actually being able to get any climbing done at all, and actually being able to get some routes done that had been on the list for quite a while. I suppose the two routes that really defined my year were Requiem and Dumbarton Rock, and a route called Dalriada, which is up high in the Cobbler. I think both of those routes had really held quite a bit of significance for me over a number of years, and to be honest, they were probably routes that I never thought I would be able to do.
What's really cool about Dalriada, for seeing this happen for Ry, we would be sitting in the kitchen, and I don't know if anyone knows about the Great Mountain Crags of Scotland book, which is one of the best books ever. It's stunning. But on that front cover is Dalriada, one of the most striking trad lines in Scotland on the Cobbler. I remember just thinking, like, Ry will do that. Ry'll definitely do that. And then that was the year when it happened. So there was Dalriada, there was Requiem as well.
So I suppose one of the things that I've always felt was most compelling about climbing, and maybe with trad climbing in particular, is the mythology that's built up around these routes. And I think that probably in Scotland, both of those routes, so Requiem and Dalriada, each come with their own story. I think Requiem is probably up there with the most mythologized routes in the country. It was first done by Cabby in 1983, and at that point it might have been the hardest route in the world of any style. And since then, it's really stood as a big testament to what could be done in trad climbing. I think I probably first became aware of that route in maybe as far back as 2006, whenever Dave McLeod had done the sort of the true finish to that with Rhapsody, and really pushed things on. And I remember as a teenager sitting across in Ireland and reading this in magazines and watching the 11 film, and it was really seemed like a big deal at the time that Scotland had some of the hardest stuff in the world. I think that whenever I'd made choices about what I was doing in my life and pursuing medicine, I kind of always thought that might be something that I might never be able to do, and it was off the cards. I would never climb E8. I'd never have the time to be able to dedicate to doing a route like that, and it was amazing, I suppose, to see that coming together. I think like that, Dalriada has a similar kind of mythology. As you say, it's on the front cover of Great Mountain Crags of Scotland. It's got that amazing photo of Dave McLeod just onto the overhang and pulling through some really hard ground in a big mountain crag. And it's definitely one of the most striking lines in Scotland, and seeing that big soaring arête, along with all the mythology about people that you've heard who've tried it, who have done it, who haven't been able to do it. It's got a big reputation as one of the must-do lines for people that are trying to climb hard in Scottish mountains. So I suppose in terms of how those routes came together, Requiem was definitely much more of a long-term project and long-term goal than Dalriada. I started working that probably in the middle of 2019, largely with the motivation of Steve Richardson, who's a local hero still getting out despite having a family and being a pretty busy guy with work. So I think going back to Requiem after the initial lockdown in May or June of this year or of 2020, it was amazing how little progress I'd made, and just how difficult the moves were feeling after almost getting pretty close in the summer of 2019. I got to the stage where I couldn't do the crux move at all in the same way I'd been doing it, and had to completely change my approach. That took quite a long time as I was seeing Steve progressing and getting closer and closer to the route, which gave me quite a bit of an added kick. Over the course of the summer, things came together actually pretty quickly, until a stage where we both felt pretty confident that the route could go, and it was just a battle through the later part of the summer to get the route whenever it was in condition, to get it whenever it was dry, amongst the typical Scottish showers that we see at the end of August. In terms of doing the route itself with Requiem, it was actually probably the ideal day for me. It was a really quiet day on the crag. We managed to get up in the late evening and just get it done. For Dalriada, I think it's really like quite a different thing. And again, with Steve, we're both pretty busy people, and we had this day earmarked in September. We had this amazing blue sky day with really nice sunshine up the top of the Cobbler. Headed up early, and then after 3 pretty good goes trying to do it ground up, Steve showed me the way up on that upper head wall, and was able to get it done. And that definitely ranks as probably one of my most special climbing achievements. It's a pretty amazing way to do a route like that, and with good friends, with good motivation, and also just be able to climb a really iconic line.
That's amazing. You're never going to forget that, are you?
Oh, absolutely not. Absolutely not. That is one of the must-do routes in Scottish mountain cragging. It's absolutely brilliant.
Well done, Matt. It's amazing. During that time working all these routes with Steve, there would have been, obviously you're working for that time, there's some quite hard things going on. Mentally, maybe when you're working, are you thinking about climbing? Are you thinking about, right, I can't wait to get back and get out on these routes? And if you are, like, what do you think climbing does for your kind of mental state in that regard?
I suppose I think I'm really lucky that I've found a career and a vocation that really is very absorbing in itself and something that I really love to do. I think that probably what climbing brings for me is maybe more of a balance. So it means that whenever I'm not at work, I've got a way of completely turning off, really focusing on something else. On-site trad climbing for me is the epitome of what I want to be doing. And I think probably one of the things that I enjoy most about that particular style of climbing is that you're completely absorbed in what you're doing. You don't know what's coming ahead and you don't have space in your brain to be able to be thinking about other things. So it's a real way of escaping from that day-to-day pressure that came with work, and probably particularly in this year came with a lot of the work that we were doing in intensive care.
So if you come home from a day, and I saw this whenever you would come home from a day of these mad 12, 13-hour shifts, I would often see you get straight on the fingerboard. Was there a real motivation that was given to you because of the pandemic to want to train, to want to try harder? Was there anything you can talk to about that?
Yeah, I think that's probably quite a good observation. I think that in those, particularly the days of April and May, whenever things were really difficult in intensive care and we were far over capacity, we were looking after patients that were as sick as any of us had ever seen, and in numbers that we couldn't even imagine. I think that bit of training through that time probably came a lot from that motivation that we got from work. So you were working very intensely, and what you really needed whenever you weren't in work was a way of turning off. And I think that's where climbing and that's where training really came in very, very useful for me. It allowed me to really direct, I suppose, my energy outside of work into something that wasn't just thinking about work, and maybe allowed me to get excited about what would happen whenever lockdown eased and whenever we were allowed outside again.
That's brilliant, because I think it's really hard sometimes to have that motivation in these kind of times. You're like, oh, I don't know when the walls are going to open, I'll be able to go back outside and all that. So I think it's brilliant that you managed to just pull through and execute on that.
Yeah, I think these things are probably a lot about having those long-term goals and things that you want to try to stay fit for, and things to have in the future to look forward to, as well as about that balance in the day-to-day.
You were talking about the crux move on Requiem earlier. Do you feel there's any sort of link between, obviously, your job can be some quite high-pressure situations. When you've got to grab that move, maybe there's a bit of doubt in your mind whenever you're on a route. Do you ever feel there's any sort of link between your job and between high-pressure situations on a route and then your work? Yeah,
that's really interesting, actually. I think one of the best descriptions I had of this was from one of our friends who described my work as being on-site medicine. I think quite often in A&E and in emergency medicine, what you do is you make decisions which are really important decisions for your patients. You make them on the basis of what at that stage is quite a limited amount of information. I think there are real strands where that connects into, from medicine to climbing, about making decisions that matter, and quite often on a route, particularly if you're trad climbing, the decisions that you make might have real consequences. And I think that there is a really nice interplay to these pretty different disciplines, but a nice way of being able to think of risk and having to make decisions as well. And I suppose that quite often those are similar things as well, where in work there is often a real importance on doing something. And I think quite often in climbing, and particularly if you're climbing in more adventurous settings, then you often have to do something to keep yourself safe or to keep your friends safe.
Well, can you tell me about a time where you had to keep your cool on a climb?
So yeah, I think quite often whenever you're trad climbing, particularly if you're trying to trad climb at your limit, you find yourself in a position where it's so important to keep your cool, keep your head together, to keep yourself safe and also to keep your friends safe. I suppose Dalriada might be a good example of that, where whenever you're climbing ground up and you're encountering terrain that you don't know what the right way to go is, you're maybe facing quite a big fall as a consequence of getting it wrong. Panicking in that situation really doesn't help at all. And I think I found myself really high up in Dalriada, really scared, really tired, and just trying to bring it back together, trying to get to a position where you can rest enough, not just to help the arms, but also to help the head. I think one of the nice things of having been climbing for a little while is that you can get to that point where if you know that you're in a safe position, you can bring that back together. And I think it was that going Dalriada where I managed to finally push up onto that final head wall and give it a really good go.
So one of the things I wanted to touch on was your work can be quite intense, mentally can be quite intense situations you can go into. Do you have any sort of mental preparation that you often do before going into some maybe big operations or anything like that? And does these things that you do, if you have anything, do they ever link to climbing?
So I suppose one of the things about emergency medicine is that often we don't have a lot of time to prepare, because you are presented with people that are really acutely unwell, often at no notice, or potentially with 5 to 10 minutes notice from the ambulance service before they're brought in. I think that probably one of the things that we're better at in emergency medicine now is putting in those foundations before the event rather than in the seconds before. So making sure that you're prepared over the course of years with a really good system for how you treat someone that's really unwell, rather than having to make it up on the fly. In terms of how that relates to climbing, again, I suppose there's that tie there. If you're climbing things that are on site, you don't really know what moves that are coming up. If you've got an idea in your mind about what you might do for any given move, then that is probably pretty important as well. And that's maybe where it links back to what I was saying about spending lots of time on rock. Doing lots of climbing to support your training is maybe the most important thing, because then whenever you're faced with a difficult move or something that you maybe haven't quite encountered before, if you've done enough moves, you'll have something in the bank. You can remember how you did it the last time, and there'll be something there that you can draw on. There'll be something that is close enough to what you're faced with that you can then hopefully execute it just as you would want.
Brilliant. I think that's so true. That's so true. It's amazing when just like a little idea comes to mind. You're like, oh yeah, I've done this move before. I can do it again.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's fantastic. Right. I think you're quite a reflective person. Can you tell me how have you dealt mentally through? Obviously, it's been an intense year. It's been pure crazy times. How do you feel you've dealt mentally through lockdown and in working on the front line throughout?
I think I've probably always been really lucky that I've had the ability to balance some of the stresses of work with other things in my life. And I think that's really important for me. As I said before, I think being able to come home after a 12 or 13-hour shift, whenever you're tired, and direct your attention to something else that is completely removed from the situations that you've been in is so important to allow you to have that time to turn off and recharge. And I think that's, for me, that's probably been the thing that has got me through some of the really difficult things in work this year, and to come out the other side and still be vaguely functional, I suppose.
So you would come home from a day and often see this little notebook come out and see some little scrawlings would appear. And I've always wondered, what you maybe like to write things down. What do you feel like that does for you?
Yeah, and that's a really good point, actually. I think as well as that balance of having that other activity to do outside of work, I've always found that sometimes whenever you're dealing with things that are particularly difficult, often maybe writing down that situation, maybe trying to almost explain it to yourself, can be really useful as a way of being able to maybe put it to one side. You know, it's then not needing to stay at the forefront of your mind. You know that you've got that memory somewhere, and if you want to return to it, then you can, but it's not something you necessarily need to focus on throughout. And certainly during this year, I know that is probably one of the biggest things that has allowed me to continue doing all of the things that I want to do during the worst of that first wave of the COVID pandemic, was writing things down as a way of processing what had happened.
You've lived in quite a few places. You hail from Northern Ireland, and you've worked and climbed in quite a few walls. And what do you think the TCA community feels like to you?
I think that's actually one of the really great privileges of being a climber and having climbed for a bit of time now, is that you're able to see lots of different communities. And I suppose one of the things that you see is that all climbing centres and all walls have their own community around them. And I've certainly found that in TCA. I think having a really good group of people that are motivated, that are interested in getting outside, that are interested in doing some training, it's a great way of being introduced to a city, and a really good way of being introduced to a new area. I think for me, the TCA has certainly brought all of that. It's brought like really good friends and contact with people like Steve Richardson that have provided a lot of the motivation to do things that I thought would never be possible for myself.
Well, I've just got one last question really for you, Ry. I think you're quite a mentally strong person. What do you think you have to thank for that?
I'm not sure that it's necessarily about mental strength for me. I suppose one of the ways that I would think of that is maybe through balance. And I've said that before, where I think that lots of what we do in getting through difficult situations is often about having that ability to go somewhere else for a while and to direct your attention to something else. I think that I'm really fortunate that I have this thing through climbing, that's something else to be able to direct my attention to whenever things are difficult in work. And actually, likewise, I think that quite often work is a really nice escape from some of the things the pressures that you have to deal with in climbing and the rest of life. And again, something that's really absorbing and something that can really consume all of your attention.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose one of those things alone can maybe be too much, and having a few of those things in the go are things that you can spread your attention across. I find that, for me anyway, that's one of the most important things.
Well, look, this has been amazing, Ry. Thank you very much for your time. Thanks a lot for your words and everything you've said. I've really enjoyed it. And thanks for everything you've done for Glasgow. For well done in your achievements. We're very proud of you.
Thanks very much, Sam. Be kind, as ever. Be kind.
So thanks everyone for watching this video, and speak to you guys again soon. Bye everyone.
Bye.